If you think about the sort of 4 factors that make something highly reinforcing or addictive, it's access, so easy access. And of course, the smartphone has become the equivalent of the hypodermic syringe, delivering digital dopamine 24/7. Access couldn't be easier. In terms of quantity really makes a difference. The more of a drug we consume, the more likely we are to get addicted to that drug. And the thing about digital products like TikTok is that they are literally infinite. You can run out of a line of cocaine. You never run out of TikTok.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey, Hilda here. When we think of addiction, alcohol and drugs may immediately spring to mind. But we can also become addicted to digital substances, so to speak, like Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok, even video games. This is episode 357, and our guest today is Dr. Anna Lembke. Anna is a professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine. Her new book is Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Anna today expounds on what happens in the brain and the body when we become addicted to chemical substances or something virtual. It often starts with dopamine, the feel-good hormone. We get hooked on a feeling, as the song says, which feels great until it's gone. And then we want more of it. Anna explains how intense digital addictions can be. She also uncovers today how to notice addictive behavior in ourselves, the sources of addiction, and she tells stories of her patients who have escaped its clutches and transformed their lives for the better. This is the first episode in our Mental Health Track series. Before we get into the conversation, I want to invite you to become a member of the Weston A. Price Foundation. If you are a longtime listener of the podcast, you've certainly heard me say this before, but the time to act is now. The foundation really is a member-supported group. It's the only way we can continue our efforts of education, research, and activism with your help. So please become a member. Just go to westonaprice.org and click on the Become a Member button and use the code POD10 to join for only $30 a year. Honestly, this is cheaper than some monthly gym memberships, and the value will last much longer than the results from a bicep curl. So go to westonaprice.org and click on Become a Member, and again, join for only $30 using the code POD10. And welcome to the family. And Redmond Real Salt. A quick glance at the ingredients label on most salts might surprise you. Many salts contain anti-caking agents, even dextrose, which is sugar, and others have been heat processed and stripped of their natural trace minerals. Not Redmond Real Salt. Real Salt brand sea salt is unrefined and full of natural minerals and flavor, the way salt was meant to be savored. Honestly, our family loves Redmond Real Salt. We're also fans of their Relight, electrolyte mixes, and even their toothpaste. So check them out. Go to redmond.life and use the code word WISE for 15% off at checkout. Again, that's Redmond, REDMOND.LIFE, and the code word WISE for 15% off. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Anna.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I think this is a really important topic, and I want to kick things off by diving into a story of addiction. Of course, you mentioned many in your book. Let's talk about some young people that you've seen who have had a cannabis addiction.
Okay. In my book, I talk about a young woman named Delilah who first came to me looking for help with anxiety and depression. It also happened that she was smoking cannabis every day. She assumed that my initial intervention for her would be to prescribe her a pill for anxiety or recommend some sort of intensive psychotherapy. But instead, what I recommended is that she cut out all cannabis for a month. And the reason for that is because cannabis is an addictive substance. It releases dopamine in the brain's reward pathway. And over time, the way that our brain compensates for that is by downregulating our own production of dopamine, not just to baseline levels, but actually below baseline levels. So that with repeated use, we need more and more to get the same effect. And we ultimately end up in a dopamine deficit state where we don't feel good when we're not using. We're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use.
Anna, when you mention that phrase, dopamine deficit, I can't help but think that so many people are struggling with that right now. You have no idea. I don't know if you spend time on TikTok or on some of the social media platforms, but the people are always talking about their anxiety and their depression and what they do to get out of a funk. So is this what they're experiencing, do you think?
Yes, exactly. And that's really one of the main reasons I wrote Dopamine Nation. I wanted people to understand that by constantly bombarding our brain's reward pathways with highly reinforcing substances and behaviors, like a lot of the digital online media that we're all consuming these days, what ends up happening is that it's way more reinforcing and dopamine releasing than our brains were evolved to tolerate. And so in order to try to compensate for all of that dopamine release, what our brains do is downregulate our own endogenous or internal production of dopamine. Again, not just to baseline levels, but below baseline levels, so that we enter this dopamine deficit state. We're essentially walking around depressed, anxious, restless, and craving our drug.
And then it's like real life seems boring because we're not getting that continual dopamine hit.
That's exactly right. And that's really one of the key points to understand. I have so many people come in, including young people who have everything you could possibly want out of life. They have elite education. They have loving parents. They have plenty of money. And yet they're restless, they're bored, they're anxious, they're not interested in their classes. They think it's because they haven't, quote unquote, found their passion. But really what's happened is that their reward pathways have been hijacked by all of the feel-good substances and behaviors that have become so commonplace in our hyper-convenient world.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit when you talk about our bodies down-regulating the amount of dopamine they produce. It reminds me of some people who try to improve their sleep patterns by taking melatonin. And I know the science is out on this, but some say the more you supplement, the less your body makes. And so that's in essence what I hear you saying happens when we take in too much of this dopamine, kind of get too much of this dopamine hit from addictive patterns. It doesn't have to be a substance necessarily, but even like you said, getting our devices, it can lead to this issue.
Yeah, I don't know that I haven't read that literature on melatonin, but in general, that principle holds true for almost all biological systems. All biological systems are governed by a very intensive physiologic drive to restore what's called homeostasis, or a level baseline. And our brains and bodies will work very hard to get back to that level baseline, so that if we are ingesting any kind of chemical that gets us out of our homeostatic baseline, then our brains will have to find some way to compensate for that. And that compensation can change our fundamental set point for whatever that physiologic function is, whether it's sleep or pleasure or anxiety or whatever it really is.
I can't help but wonder as we broach this topic of addiction, Anna, if doesn't addiction serve a purpose for us? Like, in other words, the original intent of getting a reward in our brain and then in our bodies, isn't that going to serve us in some good way? Otherwise, it wouldn't be a part of our physiology, right?
Oh, absolutely. Dopamine is fundamental to survival. It's what allows us to approach pleasure and avoid pain. And the homeostatic balance that drives the return to whatever baseline firing of dopamine that we have is also really quite genius in terms of surviving in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. However, we no longer live in that world. We now live in this world of overwhelming abundance. And it turns out that our primitive wiring and our fundamental physiology is not well adapted for this new world that we've created. There's this term called the Anthropocene, which you're probably familiar with, but it's a way of describing the way that human behavior has changed the planet. And global warming is the most obvious example of that. But another example of that is the way that we have created this hyper-convenient world where we have nearly infinite access to highly rewarding, i.e. addictive substances and behaviors at the touch of a fingertip. It really has messed with our brains because, again, this wiring that we have that processes pleasure and pain is one that evolved over millions of years in a world of scarcity and is not well suited to a world of abundance.
Wow, you're right. And just with a swipe of my index finger, I can have food appear on my doorstep, right? I can get anything I need or think I need immediately. And we weren't made for that kind of world.
That's exactly right. So getting back to my patient, Delilah, what I recommended to her as a treatment essentially for her anxiety and depression was for her to eliminate cannabis for a month. And I explained to her that that kind of period of abstinence, sometimes called dopamine fasting, will initially make her feel more anxious and depressed, because when we initially take away our rewarding substance, because we've changed our set point for experiencing reward, we will immediately plummet into that dopamine deficit state. And in the book, I use the analogy of a balance, like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. But if we wait long enough, eventually our brain and body will get the signal that incoming dopamine has been reduced and that we need to start up our own dopamine factories again. And we'll start to make our own feel-good hormones, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. Our endogenous opioid, endogenous cannabinoid systems will begin to upregulate. And eventually, and I usually recommend a month of abstinence, because in my experience, that's the amount of time it takes to reset reward pathways. Eventually, what will happen is we'll start to feel good again. And that anxiety and depression, which we were attributing to external causes or maybe to some kind of fundamental brain flaw, will actually resolve itself without any other intervention. And that's precisely what happened to Delilah. She came back a month later and said, wow, I have less anxiety and less depression than I've had in years. And I've treated many, many patients over 20 plus years for whom that has been the case, such that I've become firmly convinced that these substances and behaviors create the psychiatric symptoms that we think we're self-medicating by using them.
Oh, this is fascinating. And it's not unlike my own experience and that of my children and many, many people that I've spoken to in the realm of food. In other words, our group, the Wise Traditions group, promotes whole, real foods for nourishment is great for our satiety, but also for our bodies to function on foods that don't come with a lot of labels. And at first, our palates have been so adjusted to modern foods that are full of MSG and different chemicals that taste the right way, but don't satisfy, that if we withdraw from that, when we taste the real food, it seems bland in comparison. But then when we get accustomed to, we kind of retune our palate to real food, we start to discover the amazing flavor and nourishment that comes from the real food. Do you see the parallel making?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And it's very clear that just as we can get addicted to drugs and behaviors, we can get addicted to sugary, processed, over-salted, over-chemicalized food. And food addiction is real. What's fascinating about addiction broadly in the population is that different people will have different drugs of choice. So what's highly reinforcing for one person may not be for another, and vice versa. And for some people, food is uniquely addictive, especially processed food and sugar. When I treat patients with food addiction, really the same exact principles apply to treating patients with drug and alcohol addiction. First of all, we have to figure out what food they're addicted to. Typically, it is sugar and processed food. And then it's a matter of period of abstinence where they eliminate that category of food for long enough to reset baseline homeostasis. And then if they decide to introduce that food back into their lives, they really think in great detail about what that would look like, how often, how much, and create self-binding strategies in order to make sure that they don't overconsume those addictive foods. I basically think that in this day and age, we all have some level of disordered eating just because the food has been drugified. It's been made to be highly reinforcing and addictive. And I conceptualize disorders like bulimia as essentially addictions rather than eating disorders per se.
Wow, fascinating. And of course, I can't help but think about the book, The Dorito Effect, and another book that my friend Diana Rogers and Rob Wolf wrote called The Case for Better Meat. And in it, they talk about how scientists literally and laboratories and food manufacturers are purposely trying to make the food hyper palatable. So we're not addicted because of a lack of willpower, but it's rather by design. And that leads me to the question about our devices. You mentioned how we can have addictions to our technology and the dopamine hit we get from these things. I understand that our cell phones were designed in such a way to purposely suck us in like that. Is that true? Do you know anything about that, Anna?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's well known, and the original creators of many of the digital products have admitted as much, that they studied the motivational systems of the brain and they tested and focus grouped and road tested these products to be reinforcing and to keep people tapping and swiping. And they do that in a number of ways. If you think about the sort of 4 factors that make something highly reinforcing or addictive, it's access, so easy access. And of course, the smartphone has become the equivalent of the hypodermic syringe, delivering digital dopamine 24/7. Access couldn't be easier. In terms of quantity really makes a difference. The more of a drug we consume, the more likely we are to get addicted to that drug. And the thing about digital products like TikTok is that they are literally infinite. You can run out of a line of cocaine. You never run out of TikTok. The third aspect is potency. And as you talked about, all these chemicals added to food have made them more flavorful, made them more potent, made them more addictive. The same thing with cannabis today is much more potent than cannabis of yesteryear. Juul and e-cigarettes deliver more nicotine per unit puff than cigarettes ever did. Digital products are made potent in all kinds of interesting ways. One of the most common way is to enumerate aspects of the digital product. So if we give something a number, it tends to be more reinforcing. For example, number of likes or number of tweets or number of retweets or our ranking in a video game. Numbers really seem to elicit that dopamine response. Other aspects that make it more potent are combining 2 drugs together. So for example, people with opioid addiction know that if they combine, the opioid with a benzodiazepine like Xanax, they'll get a higher high. And the same thing happens with digital products. So, within a video game, there's a little bit of gambling. So when we combine gambling with gaming, that makes both of those things more potent. If you watch YouTube, like American Idol, it's not just the music that's out of itself pleasurable and reinforcing. It's that music has become gamified in a competition. So now you take gaming and music and you've made it more potent. And then, of course, our ability to minutely control our consumption really contributes to the addictive potential. Unlike TV 30 years ago, where you just got what you got, now we can decide and titrate exactly what we want and how much and how fast, and we can switch to something else if it's not reinforcing enough. That also then further engages our search and explore function, where we're always looking for something just a little bit better. And then the algorithms learn us and remember us and then proffer that to us to suggest that we keep going.
Coming up, Anna talks to us about the opioid crisis, and she offers a hopeful perspective on escaping addiction.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
I am so pleased to tell you about the Women's Meditation Network and a podcast called The Morning Meditation for Women. It is a wonderful way to get into the rhythm of kicking off your day with something to help you feel more calm and less stressed throughout the day. You can just be and start your day with clarity and intention using the Morning Meditation for Women podcast. My friend Katie Kremitzos offers a 5 to 10 minute guided meditation every single morning. And these are a beautiful way for you to start or jumpstart a meditation practice. So check it out. You can listen on your favorite podcast player. And again, it's hosted by a personal friend of mine, Katie Kremitzos. Her show, The Morning Meditation for Women, is part of the Women's Meditation Network. So get access to hundreds of free guided meditations now by subscribing to the Morning Meditation for Women podcast. So just search for it on your favorite podcast player, subscribe, and press play now. Or visit womensmeditationnetwork.com/morning podcast. An optimal carnivore. Organ meats are some of the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You know it as well as I do. And the founders of Optimal Carnivore also understand the amazing benefits of eating organ meats. But they know it's hard to find high-quality organ meat, and the process of preparing them and trying to make them tasty can be challenging. So, the founders of Optimal Carnivore started sourcing 100% grass-fed organ meats from New Zealand, freeze-drying the organs and encapsulating them into convenient bovine gelatin capsules. They chose New Zealand because it is a pure source, a pristine land with rich soil, lush greenery, and one of the cleanest environments on Earth. The products are 100% grass-fed and grass-finished, free of hormones, pesticides, antibiotics, and GMOs. And Optimal Carnivore knows that our ancestors would have eaten the whole animal. So, they created this unique blend of 9 different organs, a powerful combination including beef liver, brain, thymus, heart, kidney, spleen, pancreas, lung, and gallbladder. It's a real nose-to-tail solution. Each organ contains its own unique benefits and nutritional profile, and provides a large range of nutrients that support all of the major organs and glands. Again, they freeze-dry the organs to preserve all of the vitamins and minerals, proteins, and enzymes. The guys over at Optimal Carnivore believe everyone deserves easy access to the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet, and they wanted to take the guesswork and hassle out of eating organ meat. These supplements are perfect for people who are on the go or just trying to develop an appreciation for organ meat. It covers your bases at home or while on the road. I have a great diet, as you may suspect, but I also take these supplements to fill in the gaps. Plus, what I like is that they plant one tree for every product sold, which helps the environment. They currently have a grass-fed organ complex, which I was describing earlier, a grass-fed bone marrow, and a grass-fed liver product. So go to Amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and use the code Weston10 to save 10% on all products. That's Amazon.com/optimalcarnivore and the code Weston10. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Wow, there's a lot to think about, Anna, and I'm really grateful that you're shedding light on the ways in which we can become addicted to our devices and how it's it is by design that they were made and designed in this way. And of course, some of these apps. But I wanted to flip now to the opioid crisis because it is a real thing. Now, let's talk about how it started. Didn't it start innocently enough where it was simply doctors trying to help alleviate their patients' pain?
That's right. In the 1980s, with the advent of the hospice movement, there was recognition across medicine that doctors were not doing enough to help patients in pain, that patients were, especially patients at the end of life, were often dying in agony. And there was this idea that we could be more liberal with opioid prescribing, particularly at the very end of life when the risk of addiction seemed immaterial in contrast to the amount of time that person had left to live. But what happened is that messaging that was originally well-intentioned got taken over by the opioid pharmaceutical industry, such that this incredibly influential and misleading marketing campaign convinced doctors that they could prescribe opioids for minor and chronic pain conditions, that patients were not going to get addicted to the opioids as long as they were real doctors prescribing for real pain, that opioids were effective for long-term treatment when taken daily. And none of those things is actually true. It turns out that opioids, although effective short-term, that is less than 3 months for severe pain, don't actually help pain when taken daily for long periods of time. At least there's no reliable evidence to show that they do. And furthermore, it turns out that 1 in 4 patients prescribed an opioid for a bona fide, legit pain condition will develop some kind of opioid misuse problem, and 1 in 10 will develop a severe addiction. So the medical profession was essentially sold a bill of goods by Purdue Pharma and others, which then increased the amount of opioids that doctors prescribed, which increased the number of patients exposed to high-dose long-term opioids, as well as increased the number of people who were not patients, but just teenagers curious about what was in their parents' medicine cabinets, or kids trading pills at school, or drug dealers having more access to pharmaceuticals because there were just simply more pills floating around in society. And all of that led to a 4-fold increase in opioid prescribing between 1999 and 2012, commensurate with a 4-fold increase in opioid-related overdose deaths and opioid addiction treatment admissions. And it's very clear that those things are causal and not just correlative.
And why is it that this crisis, because it really is a crisis, has been so overlooked?
Well, so many reasons. There's so much misunderstanding about addiction and what causes it. So many thoughts in society that addiction is a person's choice and within their willful control, and why can't they just stop? Although I will say that is beginning to shift. The majority of Americans today, when polled about whether or not addiction is a disease, the majority will say that they actually believe that it is a disease. And that's a huge shift from even, 30 years ago when the majority polled would have said it's a willpower problem, or it's a social problem, or it's a spiritual problem. So the disease model has really taken hold, but nonetheless, we are lacking an adequate infrastructure inside of medicine to target this huge public health problem. We have centers of excellence for cancer treatment. We have centers of excellence for diabetes control. We have really almost nothing like that, with a few exceptions here and there, for the treatment of addiction. And for a long time, insurance companies also wouldn't pay for the treatment. For all those reasons, misconceptions, lack of physician and other mental health care provider training in the area of addiction, and lack of an adequate medical infrastructure to treat addiction. All those things have contributed.
Would a good place to start be to simply prescribe fewer opioids?
Absolutely. That is a fundamental first principles place to start, and that has happened. Opioid prescribing started to decrease around 2012. And although we're still prescribing more opioids nationally than we were in the 1990s, it's gone down by about 30 to 40%. However, there's enormous geographic variation, with some counties way down and other counties still prescribing a lot of opioids. And if you look at what are the correlates in the counties where people are still routinely being prescribed high-dose long-term opioids, it won't surprise you to learn those are mainly impoverished counties where people are struggling with unemployment, poverty, multi-generational trauma, limited access to quality health care, but enough access to health care to have, some lone prescriber overwhelmed by a huge population of vulnerable people and desperate to try to do something to help them, and finding that continuing to prescribe a pill is sort of all they have at their disposal. So it's a really complicated problem, and it's going to take decades to address.
And can an addiction to opioids or to other substances, such as those we've mentioned, cannabis or maybe alcohol, can they ever be managed or overcome? And I'm asking very sincerely, because I feel like when the tentacles of addiction grab onto someone, it's like we said, it's not a lack of willpower. It seems very difficult to extricate oneself.
One of the myths about addiction is that people don't get better. It turns out if you treat people in the healthcare system with addiction, treat people with addiction in the healthcare system with evidence-based treatments that we have available today, and they're biological treatments, including medications, psychological treatments, social treatments. These are well-established treatments. They've been around for decades. We know they work. If people actually have access to evidence-based treatment for addiction, they have about a 50% response rate, which is on par with the response rates to other mental health disorders like major depression, and also similar to the response rates that you see in medical disorders that have a behavioral component. So other chronic relapsing and remitting diseases like type 2 diabetes, like obesity, like certain forms of asthma and heart disease. So addiction treatment works for those who have access, who actively engage in treatment, and people get better. And when they get better, their lives are transformed and the lives of people around them are transformed. So there's no need to be pessimistic. And yet it's very interesting. Most people really are. They have this sort of image of you're going to end up, with clutching a brown paper bag, sleeping under a bench. Addiction certainly is terminal in probably a small percentage of people. But, so is cancer. We don't cure every case of cancer. Some people will die of their disease. That is true of really every mental illness, but a whole lot of people get better. And there's also something called natural recovery, where some people get better without any medical intervention at all. They just sort of figure it out and stop using. It's also true that some people, after a period of abstinence, can go back to using their drug of choice in moderation. It's a very small minority, honestly. For people who have been severely addicted, they probably have to abstain lifelong. But there are some people who have been able to figure out how to go back to using in moderation.
Interesting. Yes, I have a friend who was extremely addicted to alcohol, lost his family, lost his job, hit rock bottom, and he did not use any program. He didn't use AA or seek out medical treatment or any kind of psychological help. He simply had what you described as a natural recovery, and he made a change and he never went back, and then he started recovering his life again. So tell us a story of one of your clients that might give us some hope too, someone who might have released themselves from the grips of addiction.
Oh my gosh, so many stories. My book is full of such stories. Lots of people in recovery. They're really modern day prophets for the rest of us and how to live in this dopamine saturated world. The patient I spoke of earlier, Delilah, is one just really good example. She did the dopamine fast. She came back feeling much better, and she committed to abstinence for the month after that because she wanted to maintain her improvements. She eventually decided she wanted to try to go back to using cannabis in moderation, which many, many people with addiction do. It's very hard, especially for a young person, to imagine giving up their drug of choice for a lifetime. She did that. It worked okay for a while, but then she slipped back into her kind of addictive use. But now she had, more experience and more data, and she eventually gave it up for the long haul. So lots of stories like that. There's no one size fits all. No one path is right for everybody. But I just encourage, if you have any listeners out there who are struggling with addiction, I just really encourage them to stay hopeful and to get help. And there are lots of good treatments out there that work.
And so I have to bring this up as we get ready to close. Psychedelics. I have friends in this alternative health space who swear by them as a way to kind of open up their mind and heal their emotions and then subsequently their body. How do you see them, Anna?
Well, I believe it was George Harrison of the Beatles who said you only need to do LSD once. And I think that's probably true. And if you find yourself going back again and again, you might really want to look hard at whether or not what you're looking for is no longer spiritual enlightenment, but really some kind of addictive pull. I generally want to try to remain open-minded about the potential utility of psychedelics in certain very rare clinical situations, administered strictly adhering to, the ways in which the data have shown that it can be helpful. But as a general repeat practice, I think people are going astray. And I also think that the kind of spiritual enlightenment that people are looking for is best obtained in other ways. Ways that involve maybe intensive spiritual practices or intensive psychotherapy, slower medicine that probably leads to longer lasting neurobiological changes. And also that, require suffering and effort, because when we endure pain, that not only becomes a source of wisdom for us, but it becomes a touchstone for self-confidence and self-efficacy. We can look back and say, hey, I made it to the top of that mountain and I didn't take the gondola ride. And to me, psychedelics is a gondola ride. And if you don't have legs or you don't have enough time to walk up to the top of the mountain, and that's the only way you're going to get there, okay, one time, to get your spiritual awakening. But I don't know, I'm concerned about the level of enthusiasm for what is essentially an addictive substance. And when people say psychedelics are not addictive, they do not know what they're talking about. I see plenty of people addicted to psychedelics. Anything that's intensely mind altering, even if it's occasionally dysphoric, is going to be an addictive substance.
Well, thank you for touching on that and giving us your opinion on that. I can't help but think when you talked about that homeostasis that we're seeking out between pleasure and pain, your gondola ride was a great example of that yes, we can make it to the top in an easy way, or we could try using our bodies and then find a kind of joy that comes from the difficulty. I also think about my friends who are into cold therapy, including yours truly, who love to get in cold water and challenge ourselves because of that kind of euphoria. And I guess it's a dopamine hit too, when we succeed and we've done something hard, but then we get the reward of the pleasure afterwards.
Yeah. So as I talk about in my book, when we expose ourselves to ice cold water, what we get during the exposure is a gradual and steady increase in dopamine release that remains elevated for hours afterwards, which is very different from the kind of dopamine pattern we see after we expose ourselves to intoxicants. With intoxicants, what we see is a sudden upward spike of dopamine release followed by plummeting dopamine levels, not just to baseline, but below baseline. And then eventually, as long as we don't continue to use that substance, a return to baseline levels. But we pay an enormous price for intoxicants because we're essentially short-circuiting what was really meant to happen, which is we were really meant to have to walk tens of kilometers to get a drink of water. And in short-circuiting that, it's just enormously stressful on the brain.
Well, this is so fascinating. We will definitely have in our show description a link to your website and a place where folks can find your book and more information about you. Thank you for this conversation. I want to ask you one final question, which I always pose at the end here. If the listener could just do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do, Anna?
Well, I recommend that you ask yourself whether or not you're compulsively over consuming a substance or a behavior, especially a digital product in your life, and that you consider a period of abstinence away from that. And if you decide to do it, whether it's a day or a week or a month, that you observe in yourself how initially you feel worse as you note the dopamine deficit state and the craving. But if you can just last for the full cycle, and I consider 24 hours to be sort of the minimum full cycle, what you'll notice is you'll get to a place where that goes away and the restlessness eases. And you may even find that when you get to the end of that dopamine fast, you really don't even want to return to using that substance because you're free.
Beautifully well said. Thank you so much, Anna. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for having me.
Our guest today was Professor Anna Lembke. Get her book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence at your favorite bookstore. And I'm Hilda Labrada-Gore. You can find me at holistichilda.com. For the transcript for this podcast episode, visit our website, westonaprice.org, and click on the podcast page. And now for a review from Apple Podcasts. Chelsea Colibri says, life-changing information. I discovered this podcast in 2021 while looking for accurate information amongst the widespread propaganda and lies regarding the public health crisis. Listening to my first episode was like stumbling on an oasis of truth, sanity, and sincerity in an illogical, frightening, and confusing landscape. I was hooked. Oh gosh, I hope you weren't addicted, Chelsea. I'm just kidding, because this is an addiction podcast. Anyway, Chelsea says, a few months later, I attended the Wise Traditions Conference, which was a heartwarming, life-affirming, and totally inspiring event, unlike anything I've ever attended. My favorite part was seeing all the healthy, happy babies and kids with their calm, happy, healthy mothers. Let me tell you, folks, the proof is in the pate. Chelsea, thank you for your review. You are so kind. And we invite you too to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, leave us a number of stars, and tell us what you think of the show. And you can also join us at the Wise Traditions Conference. This year, it's going to be in Knoxville, Tennessee, October 21st to the 24th. I hope to see you there. Until then, stay well, my friend. Hasta pronto.
On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.